Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So I find myself quite touched seeing people at this gathering who we have a couple that just has moved to Seattle to be near Dhamma. We have another woman who moved just 2 weeks ago from the East Coast to be here. We have community members who've been traveling for the last year after leaving their job to pursue Dhamma. And we have all of us who have in large and small ways taken a step into this practice, this path, which is good in the middle, good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end. And that motion of stepping into an unknown, no matter how bright it can seem, is not something easily done. I think there's a really good quote by Paulo Coelho, who wrote The Alchemist, and he said, "When you're young, you know what you want, and then you forget. But life is kind, and it gives you a second chance. And then you have a choice whether to pay the price to live your own dream, your own story, or to not, and to live someone else's story, meaning your wife's or your husband's, your parents'." And what I think so meaningful in that quote is it's true. So often when you're a child or when you see a child, there's something in them which is seeded in the correct direction. And then it's also true that we often forget what that initial impetus and momentum was. And then life gives us another chance. It opens its hand and we see a path again. We see the Dhamma, we come into contact with these teachings. But it's not a simple choice then. There is a price to pay to live our own dreams. To make something sacred implies to sacrifice for it. You know, Ajahn Jeff says we want to play chess and win and keep all our pawns. And to know that there's a price, or at least what seems to be a price. And I think this is Mara. This is where Mara comes. The price is Mara's, and the story which we end up living if we do not take that moment and live our own story, our dharmic story. It's Mara's story, no matter whether it's one's family or job or society articulating it. Mara is the figure in the discourses, in the suttas. He's a shadow that runs through all the Buddha's dispensation in terms of he's always right there, trying to keep all of us within his realm. And I was at a monastery a few years ago, and a young man said, "Can I talk to you and take a walk?" So we did, and he said, "Look, I want to talk to you about Mara. Why do we never talk about Mara? He's everywhere. He's the second most prominent figure in the suttas. But we never talk about Mara, or almost never." And it's true. If there's two main characters in the suttas, it's the Buddha and Mara. And I'm reminded of a quote that the greatest trick the devil ever played was making us believe he didn't exist. And it's such a good quote, you want it to be like attributed to a philosopher in Europe, but it's just from the movie The Usual Suspects. I looked this up a few times hoping I could have some, gravitas behind it, but it's a great quote. And it's true. How did Mara pull this off where we don't talk about him? He's everywhere. And this young man told me, look, as I began to practice, I started this practice of staring in a mirror for long periods, and I wouldn't recommend this. But he said that after a while, something shifted, and I had this perception of my image became Mara's image. And it was the most frightening thing I'd ever seen. And then suddenly this thought arose, this is not me, this is impermanent. And Mara suddenly looked afraid. And then he spoke about how he would be meditating and feel these barbs of thoughts come from outside of him, these negative thoughts and impressions, and they weren't his. It was as if they were coming from elsewhere. And so we can take Mara to be many different things. He's the embodiment of death, of limitation. He's his name's Papima, the evil one, Antakara, the end maker, bondsman of the negligent. These are all the words that the Buddha uses to describe Mara. His name is related to the root Mar for death. And everything within his realm is in the death bound. But he's not like the devil in Christianity. He's actually at the apex of the heavenly sensual realms. He's a small rebel prince in the highest level of heaven, which is just a funny fact. He sort of lives in one corner of the heaven realm, and yet everything below is in his domain. And he appears whenever someone's about to make, or often, when someone's about to step into that path, into the unknown. And it's almost a trope in Buddhist cultures and in monasteries where you just expect that as soon as you're going to do something good, this is when Mara will come. It's very common that as soon as someone decides to ordain or step into some path, something will happen to make it difficult. And often if we don't know better, we take this as a sign it's not supposed to happen. This isn't supposed to be, the universe obviously doesn't want this to go as I'm hoping it will go. But if we know Mara, then we realize that often when the universe pushes back a little bit, or when an obstacle arises, often Mara will throw up obstacles in measure to the goodness you're trying to do. It's sometimes a sign that you're on the exact right path when Mara comes. And when Mara does come, and he's everywhere in the suttas, the Buddha says often one thing, I know you, Mara. Do not think I do not know you, I know you. And then Mara, and this is always kind of funny, he gets very disconcerted and downcast, and the suttas say he slumped over, looking dejected, and then he disappears into a puff of smoke. So we can actually have quite a lot of sympathy for this character. But he comes, and there's a series of suttas in the Samyutta Nikaya with the bhikkhunis. They're the 5th chapter, and they all occur in the blind man's grove, the Andavana. And if you think about, the deeper you dig in the suttas, the more you realize these resonances with different psychological aspects. And I've always thought of the blind men's grove to be somewhat representative of the subconscious. And this is where Mara comes. So you'll have each of these bhikkhunis, I think there's a set of 10 suttas, meditating in the grove, and Mara will come. And there's one with Ayasoma. Her name's Ayasoma. And Mara comes hoping to arouse fear and trepidation, and says, that state achieved by the seers, freedom, how can you, any woman, possibly achieve it with your two-fingered wisdom, which was a slur for women at the time, meaning penny pincher, two-fingered wisdom. And the bhikkhuni Soma thought, is this a human or a non-human voice? And the thought arose, this is a non-human voice, this is Mara. And she replied, what does womanhood matter? When one's mind is rightly centered, knowledge flows on, seeing rightly into the Dhamma. One who thinks, I am a woman, or I am a man, or I am anything at all, they are fit for Mara to address. And Mara, looking dejected, was disappointed. And someone just today was talking about how Mara had come to her this week. And I asked, how is Mara there for you? And she said, again, he came and just tried to convince me I'm not worthy of love. He comes like this all the time. And that's exactly how he comes, is in those old stories, and to hear that bhikkhuni and all those bhikkhunis roar their lion's roar, one who thinks, I am anything at all, only they are fit for Mara to address. And to see Mara suddenly shift from this being at the apex of samsara to just kind of a lamentable and slightly, sympathetic, or someone we could at least have some empathy for, downcast character. And I find this, Mara strikes where we care most. Those things and those relationships which are actually the most precious, which are the closest, those we love most, are often those we are angered at most, who we engage in the imaginary discussions and arguments again and again with, who we think down on, who we project on. And why would Mara try to hit us anywhere else than where it was most sacred, most precious, where the most potential for awakening lies? So I think about this often, is that when that loved one, when the husband or the wife, the child, the parent, when that same old narrative comes up about them and how could they possibly be like this, just instead of getting engaged in the whole roundabout, just say, I know you, Mara. I know you. And sometimes I find you can be a little more forceful and just say, piss off, Mara. I say that sometimes. And sometimes that's really enough, just to know Mara for Mara. And to know that relationship, because it's where Mara is coming, is why it's one more indicator of why it's precious, why it's something worth cultivating, or at least using as an aspect of the path. One of the stories of Mara from the Jataka tales, so these aren't the Buddha's words, but there's a lot of wisdom in these stories, is the one many of you have heard, probably, where the bodhisattva, the Buddha-to-be, is underneath the Bodhi tree. And Mara gets very worried that this being, the Tathagata, will slip from his grasp, and he comes with his hordes, his armies. And his armies include jealousy and greed, avarice, hatred. And Mara begins to assault the Buddha, or the Bodhisattva, with flood and arrows, coals raining down from the sky. And each time, as they enter into the Buddha's area, they don't touch his robe. It always says that. They do not touch his robe. The water, the flood doesn't wet his robe. The dust did not dirty his robe, which I've always thought of as something where no matter how forceful Mara's being, this teaching and this dispensation, the banner of the Arahants, the robe remains untainted, it's pure. But everything turns into flowers at the Buddha's feet. All the arrows, all the coals turn into flowers. The dust, I think, turns into heavenly ointment. And there's this sense that in those moments, what the Buddha is recollecting are the paramitas, the 10 spiritual perfections: giving, renunciation, patience, loving kindness, I'm not going in order here, determination, honesty. And that if we use obstacles in life and its difficulties, if all the slings and arrows of misfortune, of Mara, are held as within the view and the purview of cultivating the paramitas, then they all just become flowers. If you really turn towards that first noble truth of difficulty and friction as a chance to cultivate care. Many of you will have heard the story of Gurdjieff, who was in a community, and there was one very difficult member of the community who was always making everyone deeply angry. And one day Gurdjieff was gone. He's a Sufi, I believe a Sufi teacher. And they chased off this one character who he went over the top. And when Gurdjieff returned, he said, where's that, what's his name? And they said, well, we made him go. We chased him off. We were just sick of him. And he said, where is he? I pay him to be here for all of you. And if the Four Noble Truths are held correctly, then the directive of the first noble truth to understand suffering, to comprehend suffering, and let go of its source, craving, means that if we can really turn towards the difficulty in life with gratitude as a chance to learn, to grow in patience and care, then that's the catalyzing element for the rest of the alchemy of the Four Noble Truths. And it ushers into the path and to the cessation of suffering in the path. So if we really hold those slings and arrows of Mara's army as within the realm of right view, of yoniso manasikara, of proper attention, that they become flowers. The other amazing thing about that story, we asked Ajahn, my teacher, once about Mara, and he said, yes, Mara is arrogance, it's pride, it's the part in you or in anyone who comes to the monastery and they're giving a robe or a gift and they want everyone to see them. They want to be foremost in front of everyone. And just to acknowledge, we all have this in us. Praise and censure are deep motivators for everyone. But it's important to see that Mara has domain over even the Devas, even the angels, whose prime qualities are generosity, kindness, learning, faith. And so Mara can co-opt all those qualities. Generosity can be co-opted by pride. Faith can be co-opted by pride and disparaging others who do not share that faith. So always with each of these bright, luminous qualities, even the angel-like qualities, one has to keep an eye out for Mara. There he is. And this pride that wants to be known and seen is worth noting, because this is where Mara often makes himself prominent. And so what's so interesting at the end of the episode with Mara's army is Mara finally challenges the Buddha. The first paramita is giving, dana, but it's also the last one that the Buddha perfects in the Jatakas, in those tales of his rebirths. It's the last and kind of almost the jewel in the crown. And that's something so powerful to know, is that giving, the most simple act, the first of the paramitas on the path to perfection, just an act of just giving. If beings knew, as I knew, the fruits and results of giving, they never would eat without first having given. Even if it was their final morsel of food, they would never eat if there was someone to give it to without first having given. Because beings do not know, as I know, the fruits of giving, they eat without having given. Stinginess overcomes their minds. It's the quote. So this parami, this is the final ground that Mara takes a stand on, and says, what right do you have to sit in this, he calls it the Bodhimanda, the seat of enlightenment, the Bodhimandala it's short for. And, all these people, all these beings around me, Mara says, have witnessed my giving in my past. He calls these beings with consciousness, sacetana. And it's true, Mara probably has done a lot of giving in his past. He's one of the highest of angels. But he says, all these beings have witnessed my giving. Who has witnessed yours? What right do you have to sit on the apex of enlightenment? And at that point, all the Devas lament in this story. And they all say, the Buddha, the Tathagata, or the Bodhisattva, now he will never ascend to the summit of becoming. And the Buddha doesn't try to. The Buddha says, I only have the earth as my witness. And he reaches out a hand, and many of you have seen this mudra, where the Buddha touches the earth, and he calls the earth to witness. So where Mara calls all these people, he says, have seen his goodness, his giving, the Buddha, not only does he not want to ascend to the seat of becoming, he's aiming for something completely different than becoming. He's aiming for non-becoming, this ground of the non-manifest upon which all rests, or maybe I can't say that, the ground of non-becoming, of awakening, which is beyond and apart from the whole realm of samsara. This is, I think, resonant with the Buddha touching the ground and calling the earth to witness. And I'm really struck by that motion where this path is not one of kind of hyping ourselves up to some higher vibrational, artificial state, but grounding in the depth of our vulnerability, of our intimacy, of care, of wisdom, of humanity. And that is where we touch the earth. And that is where we call forth a witness, which in this story shakes and speaks out and says, I've witnessed the Buddha's giving. And it's the earth herself speaking, a feminine force. And all Mara's armies flee, and this is the Buddha's victory. So when we do an act of goodness and just want to be seen, maybe you just hint, maybe you kind of sort of do the good act, but you wouldn't mind if a few people saw you, or maybe you just linger a little longer than you need to, after you've done the good act, so that maybe someone might just catch a glimpse. It's understandable. But I've been astounded by how much potentizing power doing good with the intention of it being unknown has, because you're witnessed by the earth, by something very profound. And people do find out, they do. But I was struck, when I was at Wat Mapjan, the monastery I ordained at, one day, I think I'd eaten too many desserts or something, and I felt guilty. And I was a new monk. Not that I don't do that ever anymore, but I decided to clean one of the whole big bathrooms. And I very much knew and saw myself hoping someone would see me, but I made a really explicit intention not to do it so that no one would know, until I talked about it in a Dharma talk years later. But I really afterwards had something. Somehow, like, people did find out about this small act, but it was potentized in a way I had not expected. It's as if the angels themselves found out or something. And I found that so true with the little unknown acts. You don't have to worry about them echoing into silence and them not resonating. The ground of reality bears witness to our goodness. And there is something that happens when we do good and walk on this path with a faith that is the case, that the earth itself is our witness. Because what happens when you do good in quiet, when you have faith and when you don't buy into that part of you which wants to be acknowledged, to jump into the conversation, to go to the front of the line. The Christians call this agare contra, a bending against, or the Buddha might say, going against the stream. When you want to go to the front of the line, what does it mean to go to the back? When you want to jump into the conversation and be seen and heard and foremost, what does it mean just to hold still? Maybe take 5 minutes and go, just sit quietly for a second and then re-enter the situation when Mara has divested themselves from your heart. And you know that difference, and you know the hidden majesty that lies on the other side of that wounded beast screaming in you for acknowledgement, that raw wound that vibrates, is if you stop and let Mara's armies fade and scatter and touch the earth, come into your body, close your eyes for 2 minutes. The hidden majesty on the other side of that is ever nourishing. And you know it when you see it. We went to Vancouver last year with Ajahn Jayasaro. And there was a man we met. He'd been a steward for Birkin. And I think he might have had Parkinson's, but he couldn't speak almost at all. A little bit, but his voice was wavery. And I think he said just a few sentences to us. And the sweetness that bled through his voice, that came through his voice, impacted me more than almost any words I had heard that whole month. There's a Christian saying that the less well-known, the larger the angel. And just to have faith that you, in coming to this path, have touched into a strata and a storyline utterly different than the fraught and failing 8 worldly conditions upon which most of us build the sandcastles of our identity, because it will always fail. There will always be someone who succeeds in the job where you should. Our relationships will never be quite what what we want them to be. People will not acknowledge us as we wish they would. And as long as we tie our hearts to that, we are within Mara's domain. And so to know that motion of seeing Mara, acknowledging Mara, touching the earth, coming back to center, and acknowledging that there is a sacred ground you have found now, and it is unassailable. It is a refuge here and now. And the karma of turning any karma, bright or dark, into the karma of the path through appropriate attention, through looking at suffering as a source of learning and growth, it never fails. I think that's about it. Okay.
Handamayan Dhammakataya Sadhukaram Dharamase.
Sadhu, 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 anumodami. We have time for some questions and whatever people would like to discuss. Jessica, if you're on Zoom, feel free to raise your electronic hand and our AV crew will call on you.
Thank you so much for this talk. Feels extremely relevant. I feel like I've been in a standoff with Mara all week. You said something about, these were not your words, but it was something like the power of Mara's punch also shows you that you're on the right track. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, one has to hold that with a certain degree of discernment. Because sometimes you have an intention and the world really, conditions are not aligned for it to come together, and one has to be sensitive to when that's the case. But I also really find that, there's a sutta called the Sudatta Sutta about Anathapindika. Who here knows Anathapindika in the suttas? He's one of the most foremost laymen. Good, Ajahn. We'd have a talk otherwise. But his given name is Sudatta, and he hears the Buddha has come. No, he goes on a business trip and is sleeping. But he hears that the Buddha is nearby, and he wakes up and he tries to leave the city to visit the Buddha. And 3 times, this darkness comes, and he gets terrified and starts to turn around. And each time a yaka named Sivaka comes and says, "Do not turn back, Sudatta. 1 step forward now, a 16th of a step forward now is worth all the wealth in the world." And after the 3rd time, Sudatta, Anathapindika, continues to walk out the gate into the unknown. And he sees the Buddha walking in a grove. And instead of addressing him by his kind of common name that everyone would know, Anathapindika, the Buddha calls him Sudatta, says, Sudatta, come and sit. And Sudatta thinks, the Buddha has addressed me by my given name, and they sit together. That these stories have so much in them. Anathapindika's leaving something in him, even though he's just heard the Buddha's name, he's never met him, has called him forward into the unknown, out of the gate, in the dark. But 3 times he's turned back. And each time it's not like a Deva that turns him back to the Buddha, it's a yaka. Like, they're basically these kind of ogreish beings. Like, sometimes you need a little yaka energy to get you to take that step, you know? It's not always, it sometimes requires a little bit of humph. And the Buddha knows his name. And the path knows our name. At the deepest level, it calls us by our name. So I just find it's very common that if you have found something that feels right, and I think, you know, the people I referenced just this at the beginning of the talk who've made big changes around a move in their life or giving up something, there's usually some obstacle or fear or voice that says you should not do this. And maybe it's external, but often I think it's just internal, this fear of the unknown. But I think it's weird how often it is external that it comes up. And just knowing sometimes this isn't an indicator I shouldn't do what I'm doing. It's sometimes an indicator like, this is exactly the right thing, and I know it deep down, and I see you, Mara, you know, so.
Thank you so much.
There's a Zoom question from Jeff Kempton.
Jeff, please.
I have a question on this path. When you're following it, you correct a lot of things that deprive the mind of peace and the ability to easily go into mindfulness and stuff. And what I'm wondering is if there's people out there with like supposedly something like bipolar, and some of that stuff that happens is out of their control, it seems. So it seems, does that mean that suffering, like the depression of a bipolar, is outside the Four Noble Truths? I mean, it is impermanence. The mind is always shifting, but it feels like it's out of control, like they can't do anything productive without meds. So I wanted to know what some wisdom on that.
Thank you, Jeff. I think we, you know, especially as monks, need to have humility around this. I do think the Four Noble Truths are always applicable, and if taken far enough, I think they can refine any heart to purity. And often, if we just have one approach of meditation, a certain technique, it's a very long path just that way. And I think expedient means and professional help are essential for many kinds of suffering and trauma and patterns. So, no, I would advise, you know, if someone's going through deep depression or bipolar or has deep trauma, I think we just had an interview with Amatanasanti about working with trauma. And I think there's really a place for bringing in these other expedient means and skillful means that, you know, the West has cultivated as well. So I really would say that I think there's very much a place for that. I think all that can be held in the context of a practice with often, you know, an element of meditation and the path as a whole. And yeah, just to have patience with that process, I'd say. One thing I've seen about those deepest patterns is I think sometimes traumatic sankhara, those patterns don't soften like normal sankhara do, normal patterns or programs. Sometimes the clockwork of suffering is still turning and solid, and it can seem like nothing's changing. But what I've noticed in people who have that kind of pattern, at least from my very limited perspective, is the space around the clockwork clockwork is getting wider and wider. And even though the crescendos of that pattern and difficulty can look just as intense, they often last much less time. And I think it's important to note that as well, even with those most stubborn patterns, like often something's changing at the same time. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Jeff. And I'd say using expedient means and skillful means is well within the purview of this path. Would you add anything else?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. And just adding a little bit on there is that, part of the path is letting go and gaining skill in finding types of happiness and types of well-being, even pleasure, types of pleasure which are less and less harmful, which are more and more harmless and more subtle, more refined, and actually getting a sense of the flavor of the happiness of peace. That's the direction that we should be leaning into. And yeah, on a different time horizons, things might seem more or less peaceful. Like if we're taking on a practice of, just purifying our ethics, or we're giving something up which we've been addicted to for a while. There's going to be a period of time where it seems unpeaceful. Our minds become seemingly more riled up because we become habituated to and addicted to certain substances and certain patterns. So we give that up, and things seem more chaotic in our lives for a bit. But the longer time horizon, which is what we should be learning to get a flavor for, is one of more peace. So seeing that, having a sense of what, when I do it, will lead to my long-lasting welfare and happiness. That's a question which the Buddha says leads to discernment. What is the cause of discernment? It's asking wise people, what, when I do it, will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness. So getting a sense of the flavor of the happiness of peace is really important.
Thank you again.
Oh, wait for the mic.
So before we started the meditation, you were asking us to reflect on our ultimate goal in life, which I thought was pretty cool. And I was wondering, when you were talking all about samsara, it would be helpful for me to get a little more context on the Buddhist, whatever you call the characters and the whole realms and everything. What would you say Mara's ultimate goal is?
That's a good question. I think he wants power, and one of his titles is Adhipateya. Am I getting that right? Foremost in authority. He loves having beings in his control, and he'll use any means to keep them within. Like when the Buddha gives up his asceticism, he lays into him for that, saying, "Oh, what are you doing? Just like giving up your ascetic practices." When the Buddha first leaves his worldly life to renounce, Mara is there at that moment saying, don't step into this renunciant path. Just live a good life, make merit. It's a very common and seductive narrative, people. And so Mara will use whatever he can to keep people from slipping out of his control. After the Buddha attains awakening, he tries to keep the Buddha from teaching, because he doesn't want more beings to be freed. I think Mara wants control. And, once again, this cosmology is very deep. It shouldn't be dismissed. The fact that the Mara is at the apex of samsara, of all the sensual realms, it could be looked at as like, in the end, no matter how we're manifesting our patterns, what we all want is just a measure of control, which is a really sympathetic thing to want. We just want some control over what's going on, that's understandable. So that's what Mara wants. Sid.
Jen, just one question popped up in my mind when you were saying this. So we see in the Buddhist stories, the Mara was there when the Buddha was trying to go to asceticism or to that, and then also Mara comes back when he was about to get into the final enlightenment. So in between time, when the Buddha was going to different teachers, different things, what was Mara's role at that time? Maybe silly question.
So there's a book called The Buddhist Cosmos by Longpa Punadamo. You could just, it's free online, type in Buddhist Cosmos Punadamo. We interviewed him 2 weeks ago. It's an amazing book, and you just look up the Mara chapter, and he pretty much lists every instance of Mara coming to the Buddha before and after his awakening. It's a really great book. He also has a YouTube series on all the cosmos, which is a blast. So I don't know exactly, it's actually pretty scant. There's not a lot in the suttas of the Buddha's life before his awakening, actually. A lot of it's kind of supplementary material from the Jatakas and more. So I don't think, even that story of Mara trying to block the Buddha from renouncing, that I believe is a Jataka tale or commentarial. But a lot of them are in the suttas, but mainly after his awakening, which is a good indicator that this wasn't considered purely a simile, an analogy in the suttas, because if the Mara is still approaching the Buddha after his awakening, then it's not just a manifestation of greed, hatred, and delusion. It's something else too. So, yeah. David, sure? It's not just Mara keeping you from... Okay. Okay.
My question is around being kind of taught what is wholesome and ethical and following some rules, and versus figuring it out through, I don't know, intuition or living your life over time, with the idea that I think what's implied is Mara is sort of part of your who you are, and you're figuring that out. And I guess the questions are the roles of both being taught and kind of working it out through experience. I think most of us want to be genuine, or with the goal of feeling like we're being ourselves, we're being genuine, we're not. I don't know, the culture doesn't really support, I'll just be good because my teacher said it, or I'll, whatever. So I feel more comfortable with the being genuine piece, but then I'm curious about the experience of limitations of that.
Yeah, thank you, Moffitt. It's a great question, and so much of the path, the verse which we hardly ever chant here in Clear Mountain, but which is chanted, several times a day at most monasteries, are these 6 qualities of the Dhamma. The Dhamma is that which leads inward, that which is timeless, that which is apparent here and now. And yeah, a lot of our practice, I think most of us maybe who weren't born into Buddhist families and a Buddhist culture, we just can't. It's like, even if we wanted to, we couldn't just take everything immediately on faith. Or if we do, or if we try to, it's rather brittle. Like our kind of unquestioned faith is brittle, and it's not as strong as it can be if we actually look deeply into these things. And I just found that the Buddha's discourses, like purported to go all the way back to the Buddha, just ask great questions for my own reflection. So this question around what is wholesome, what is unwholesome, what's kusala is the Pali word. What's akusala? Kusala meaning related to having skill in something, specifically skill in cutting grass, kusa grass. So a kusala is someone who has skill in cutting this type of grass, which if you hold it incorrectly will just cut your hand. So it's about holding, learning how to hold. It's about skill in that. And some of the questions are, what when I do it will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? What when I think it, or when I say it, or when I do it, leads to my own affliction, to the affliction of others, to the affliction of both, which has long-lasting implications, which lead to my own detriment and the detriment of others. So those are just great questions. It's a very pragmatic ethics that leads to, an ethics of truly examining deeply for ourselves, what is causing affliction for myself, not just in the moment, but over time, what causes affliction to others, not just in the moment, over time. And that's how we can judge our own sense of precepts or principles or ethics or moral sense. And the Buddhist teachings go a lot deeper than that, about just what mind states, what thoughts, when we think them, lead to our own affliction, to the affliction of others, to the affliction of both. And yeah, I've found that these suttas really are there are lots of different voices. It's not just all the Buddha. It's voices of his enlightened monk disciples, his enlightened nun disciples, his enlightened male lay disciples, his enlightened female lay disciples. And there's a lot of depth there, and it can get great prompts for ways of thinking. And yeah, just leaning into that, knowing that, say, for yourself or for myself, each of us at different times, there's full allowance to ask good questions, and just getting more of a sense of what is a good question, and then giving ourselves the time and space to ask that, and checking in with teachers who we trust, who maybe have been practicing longer, who, when we're near them, we just get a sense that, okay, this person seems, at least in the moment, seems like they've got some grounding, and just using that as a mirror to test our sensitivity, our growing sensitivity. So, how does that land? So.
Ajahn Kova and I have a metric where we say WWLPPD, what would Long Parpasano do? So we do that a lot. Just one thing. First, at the end of that confrontation between Mara and the Buddha, the last weapon Mara hurls is a wheel edged with razors. And it's a mirror image of the Dharma wheel. And it's interesting because you do find you can take on the Dharma wheel, the Dharma path, in a way with an edge and a violence and it's a poor counterfeit. And I think a really good way to see if you're doing that and being inauthentic in the sense of kind of doing some violence to something very important is this metric of flourishing normalcy and warmth. Those are really important words to keep in mind for modern practitioners, I think. The other is to know that one of Mara's daughters is arati, discontent. And the cure to arati is mudita, rejoicing, the third Brahmavihara, rejoicing, appreciation. So the more of that you can get in your life, if this path seems dry or forced, what roots do you have towards mudita? Bringing people over for a meal or rejoicing in this or having appreciation or gratitude. That's all mudita, and it's the direct counter to Mara. And the final thing, I think, is in the Kalama Sutta, where the Buddha is talking about how we can discern truth from falsity. What gets quoted all the time is don't go by words of a lineage, don't go by hearsay, but rather when you know for yourself, this is wholesome, this is unwholesome, undertake those practices that are wholesome. What doesn't get quoted is the next part, which says, what is praised and censured by the wise. So yes, your own kind of wisdom is important, but then as Ajahn Kovila was saying, referring to wise people and teachers, and what would they praise? And often that's very clear. And the third, and this almost never gets noted, is the Buddha says, develop loving kindness. And there's something about the state of metta, which is so pure and simple that it's like a mirror. Like if you're ever really unsure if something's right, often if you just manage to get into a state of real pure care and ask yourself the question, it'll be right there because it's so simple. It's just a clean mirror. So I think those are important to keep in mind too.
Thank you for the talk. It was great. Regret, remorse, and shame, which sometimes can be corrective, I think, but other times, usually, they have teeth and claws and shred us. Any words on that?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Good to see you, Jeremy. First time. Yeah. Yeah, in Pali, it's really interesting to go back to some of these scriptural words because there's a lot of clarity around them, and there are different Pali words for the wholesome variety of like intelligent shame or intelligent retrospection, which sees that thing that I did was unwholesome. It actually did hurt me and it hurt others. And that sense of compunction or conscience is to be developed. The Buddha said that's one of the bright protectors of the world. It's a beautiful mind state, a sobhana cetasika, a bright mind state which leads us onwards. So really protecting that sense and getting a sense, being able to better and better hear, like, okay, this is the voice of Hiri Ottappa. This is the voice of that intelligent conscience, the sense of scruples of, yeah, that wasn't wrong. And the flavor of that is one of not selfing. The language of shame and guilt, to the extent that those are unhelpful and downward leading and kind of this spiral of selfing, is this flavor of self. It's got so much of me invested in that. So really discerning, and because they can sound so similar but have such different effects. The intelligent, okay, that wasn't wise, and I don't want to do that again, and I can take proper steps to not do it in the future. Here's what I did that led me there, and there's a clarity around it, there's a brightness around it, there's a beauty actually in listening to that and becoming a connoisseur of that voice. But then the other voice, which is just totally self-castigatory, which is just making up all sorts of stories about me and how it's my problem and I'm problematic, and that is not helpful. It just weighs us down. That's a voice which feeds depression and feeds this large ego. Actually, it seems like it's the voice of non-ego, whereas it's just an underside shadow ego. Having friends to be able to speak to, who can say, actually, that voice, what you're describing to me, that sounds like the voice of Mara. That sounds like the voice of, that sounds like a dark voice, which I wouldn't want you as a friend to listen to more. But this other voice of, that's an intelligent voice. Lean into that because it seems like it's leading upwards and towards light. So having friends, teachers, family who you can really test your inner voices out on, that's really helpful. And just being your own friend in that way too, because they're quite different, even though they can ostensibly, it's like on paper, the same words. It seems like there's not a valence to a certain word, whereas a certain sentence, a certain clause, whereas it can have complete negative valence when said out loud. Similarly, the intentions behind what these voices are saying are really what's most important. Yeah.
Just when you have someone in your life you can refine that Hiri-ottappa with, it's worth a lot. And whenever Ajahn Kova and whenever I say something kind of unbeautiful, maybe I'll come over to his kuti afterwards and yell in through his window that I'm sorry. And we had to establish a rule. I could only do it once a night because I kept bothering him.
Okay, well, thanks everybody.